Tonight, would you turn to 1 Kings, the book of 1 Kings, the 18th chapter, 1 Kings chapter 18. It's so good to have Larry back with us, and also Lupe Valdez. It's good to have her back with us too. And all of you who've come back on a beautiful Sunday night to worship God, the Milan Church of Christ. Thank you for being so in love with God, so committed to Him, to come, many of you for the second time today. For the next few Sunday nights, we are going to revisit another well-known story from the Old Testament. In fact, this story is better known than the one we've been talking about on Sunday mornings, the man of God who went and pronounced those curses on the altar up in Bethel. But this story has some great applications for us, and according to Romans 15, verse 4, whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. And this lesson will really help restore, or not so much restore our hope. I think a lot of us have it strong, but even make that hope stronger. So 1 Kings chapter 18, let me just give you the background for this reading. I'm going to adjust this mic. It keeps getting changed and right in the way of my notes sometimes. Now, for several generations, the northern kingdom of Israel had been ruled by some very wicked kings. And the one we were talking about the last two Sunday mornings, Jeroboam, was one of the worst. But at the time of this reading, King Ahab was king. And he was about as bad as Jeroboam, in some respects even worse. And part of the reason, because he chose to marry a pagan woman by the name of Jezebel. She was a worshiper of Baal and Baal's so-called wife called Asherah. Now, Paul warns God's people, and this would even go back to the Old Testament, but certainly Christians today in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14, that we're not to be unequally yoked together. And what he's talking about there, he's talking about a Christian marrying an unbeliever or a non-Christian. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? Unfortunately, King Ahab totally disregarded that teaching. And by the way, that teaching of Paul is also found in the Old Testament. The Jews, the Israelites, the people of God were to be very, very careful about marrying a faithful Israelite, not outside, and Ahab ignored that. Well, God sent Elijah the prophet to warn Ahab and the northern 10 tribes that God's wrath was coming upon them because of their rebellion. In fact, at one point, Elijah decided to pray about this, and he prayed specifically to teach Ahab a lesson and the 10 northern tribes that God would stop the rain. And God heard that prayer. In fact, James 5, verse 17 makes reference to that. God withheld the rain for an unprecedented length of time, 3.5 years. And due to the severe famine that resulted, Elijah and King Ahab were not on very good terms, and that's to say the least. All right, so 1 Kings chapter 18, starting at verse 1. And it came to pass after many days, now that is many days with no rain, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go present yourself to Ahab. And by the way, that was a challenging assignment, a very dangerous thing to do, because Ahab had been looking for Elijah with the intent of, at worst, killing him outright, at best, maybe putting him in prison and letting him rot and die there. So go present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. So there's going to be some good news if Ahab and the people have at least learned part of their lesson. So Elijah went, didn't hesitate, to present himself to Ahab, and there was a severe famine in Samaria. And I want you to remember something. There's a lot of little lessons in the story. One of them is whenever any nation rebels against God for long enough, God will have patience for a while, but only for a while. God will eventually bring calamity upon that nation, which could easily happen to ours. You know, we see a lot of things in our nation today that are negative in terms of the effects of the war in the Ukraine and the inflation, high gas prices and whatever. That's not a calamity, not in terms of Bible calamities. Much worse could be on its way. Proverbs 14, verse 34, Solomon said, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. A reproach means in God's sight, sin causes a people to be spurned from his sight, where he would reject them and, of course, punish them. All right, verse 3. And Ahab called Obadiah, who is in charge of his house. Now, Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. He was a very good man, obviously. For so it was, while Jezebel massacred the prophets of the Lord, she was trying to wipe them all out, that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them, 50 to a cave, and had fed them with bread and water. So this is a very godly man. And his service, his kindness serves to remind us that God uses people like us to bring good to others. In fact, in Psalms 5 and verse 12, David wrote, for you, O Lord, will bless the righteous with favor. You will surround him as with a shield. And I appreciate Alex's comment about the good works that the church is doing and will be doing here. And the Icon Ella, the Walking with Angels, to raise money for that charity is a great service to others. And for some, it gives some families the opportunity to really hear about God and Jesus Christ for the first time, and the giveaway that we'll have, and other things as well. All right, verse 5. And Ahab said to Obadiah, go into the lands, to all the springs of water, and to all the brooks. Perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive so that we will not have to kill any livestock. It's kind of amazing after 3.5 years that they had much livestock left anyway. But here's what's interesting. So they divided the lands between them to explore it. Ahab went one way by himself. Why would a king go on any such mission by himself? Wouldn't he have an entourage? Soldiers at least going with him to protect him? Nobody knows for sure, but my guess is that nobody would believe that he would even find grass somewhere. I think maybe he could have commanded some men, but I find it striking that he would go out on his own to try to find some grass to feed the animals. And Obadiah went another way by himself. Now that would be kind of expected, but the king by himself, wow. Verse 7. Now, as Obadiah was on his way, suddenly Elijah met him, because Elijah was sent by God to Ahab. And he recognized him and fell on his face and said, is that you, my Lord, Elijah? So Obadiah has great respect for the prophet. And he answered him and said, it is I. Go tell your master. In other words, Ahab, Elijah is here. Which of course concerns Obadiah greatly. Verse 9, so he said, how have I sinned that you're delivering your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? Well, how would he get that? Well, you'll see. As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to hunt for you. And when they said he is not here, this is something Ahab would force the person to do. He took an oath from the kingdom or nation that they could not find you. And now you say, go tell your master, Elijah is here. And here was the problem in Obadiah's eyes. And it shall come to pass, as soon as I am gone from you, that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you to a place I do not know. And sometimes God does that. Sometimes he directs God's people in certain directions. Sometimes without their even realizing it. Solomon said in Proverbs 16, verse 9, a man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And thank God he does. Getting back to Obadiah. So when I go and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, he will kill me. But I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Was it not reported to my Lord what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? How I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets, 50 to a cave, and fed them with bread and water? And now you say, go tell your master Elijah is here. He will kill me. So he was just concerned that Elijah wouldn't stick around very long for whatever reason. Verse 15, and Elijah says, and he makes a promise to him. Gives him some assurance. As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely present myself to him, Ahab, today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. Verse 17, then it happened when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, is that you, O troubler of Israel? Isn't it interesting how sometimes the wicked will blame the righteous for their problems? There are people in America today who are blaming the ills of America on Christianity, saying that Christianity is too restrictive, Christianity is too polluted with prejudice and phobias, and that's what's causing our... Well, people just do that, just as Ahab did back then. And he, Elijah, answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, and that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals. You see, the god Baal represented other gods too. He was a kind of a god of fertility, but he was also considered having relatives as gods of fire and other things as well. But one thing I want you to notice here, it's easy to escape our attention. The order that Elijah gives here. First of all, the king and the people forsook God's commandments. And as soon as you forsake, which means go away from, abandon, leave behind the commandments of God, you will always, always follow something else or worship something else, as was in the case with Ahab. Verse 19. And by the way, Elijah says, all right, it's time for a showdown to teach the king and the nation a lesson. He says, now therefore send and gather all Israel, all the northern 10 tribes. I don't know how many there were, but I imagine there were at least 1 million, probably more than that. That's not counting the kingdom of Judah down in the south, but there were still a lot of people in those 10 tribes. So send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel. That was part of a mountain range up in the northern Israel. The 450 prophets of Baal, a lot of prophets, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, supposedly Baal's wife, who eat at Jezebel's table. And Jezebel, she entertained those idolatrous prophets, which is just part of her problem. One thing I want you to note, unfortunately, mankind tends to follow numbers. What I'm talking about is great numbers tend to impress people. The sheer number of false prophets of Baal and Asherah probably impressed the Israelites. How could so many people be wrong? You know. But I hope you'll remember, and I hope I'll always remember, that numbers by themselves seldom indicate what's right. I was challenged to do this years ago, and I've tried, and I could not argue. The challenge was find any place in the Bible where the majority is ever right. And I've never found it. If you do, let me know. But I know years ago when I first heard that, and it was many years ago, I searched and I could not find it. Folks, numbers by themselves very seldom indicate what's right. In fact, part of the commands of God in Exodus chapter 23 and verse 2, Moses told Israel, you shall not follow a multitude to do evil. Multitude there would have to do with a very large crowd. If they do wrong, don't follow them. Unfortunately, Ahab and Jezebel did not follow that. All right, verse 20. So, you got to give Ahab a little credit here. He complies. All right, didn't have to, but he does. So Ahab sent for all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets. So you got 850 prophets and the nation, northern part of the nation, on Mount Carmel. So this is an amazing sight with all these people. And Elijah came to all the people and said, and I think God had to miraculously amplify his voice. They had no PA system back then, no way to amplify your voice, but I think God did. So I think he yells to the top of his lungs, as we would say, how long will you falter between two opinions? We would say, how long are you going to sit on the fence? And the Israelites and Ahab were pathetic. Due to ignoring God's laws, they no longer knew who the real God was. So they were constantly vacillating between Jehovah and Baal, depending on how you feel. Well, I feel pretty good about Jehovah today. Let's worship him. Somebody might say, well, I prayed to Baal and he did this. Let's go to worship him. Okay, that sounds good to me. It was kind of that way. And basically, Elijah said, that's enough. Enough of it. Let's settle this thing. Continuing verse 21. If the Lord is God, speaking of Jehovah, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. It's almost like he was saying it's better to pick one God and follow him than to divide your affections as they were doing. And then the amazing thing is, but the people answered him not a word. And that's sad because the people really didn't know. They'd been so far gone from faithfulness to God for that long that they had no idea who the real God was. And a lot of people like that today. So many people even in this community have no idea who God really is. Even less of them really understand who Jesus Christ really is. Well, Elijah came up with a plan, and I think this was an inspired plan, and I think we'll see that in just a few moments, to help the people out, to help them to make the right choice. Verse 22. Then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of the Lord. Now, he wasn't correct there. We'll find out that later when we get into part 2 of the story. There were others who followed the Lord. They didn't do it very publicly, but there were others who had not bowed the knee to Baal. We'll get on that later. But Baal's prophets are 450 men, and that's not even counting, by the way, the 400 prophets of Asherah. Therefore, let them give us 2 bulls. I mean, they had plenty of animals still that hadn't died in the famine. And it's interesting that Elijah says, and you know what? I'll let them up to bat first. I'll give them every advantage. In other words, we'll have a 1-inning game. And if they win at the top of the first, game over. I won't even come up to bat, as it were. If you listen to the Tigers lose today, yeah, you don't understand that. All right. All right. So therefore, let them give us 2 bulls. Let them choose 1 bull for themselves. Cut it in pieces. Lay it on the wood. But put no fire under it. And he had to tell them that because they normally think, okay, if we're going to offer a sacrifice, we're going to build a fire right now. No, that's the one thing you're not to do. And I will prepare the other bull, lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. Then, he's speaking to the 400 prophets of Baal, or 450, maybe the other prophets too. And then you call on the name of your gods, so-called, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. So at least the people finally came to a united decision. So all the people answered and said, it is well spoken. In other words, sounds good to us. Verse 25. Now Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose 1 bull for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many. And call on the name of your God, and again, so to speak, but again, don't try to pull a fast one here. Don't put any fire under it, all right? No cheating. So they took the bull which was given to them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning even till noon. So several hours, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice. No one answered. And obviously they're wasting their time. Then they leaped about the altar which they had made. So they're trying to get Baal's attention. And this does not escape the notice of Elijah, as you'll see. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud. In other words, cry out louder. For he is a God. And he's speaking sarcastically. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey. Or perhaps he's sleeping and must be awakened. Try harder. Verse 28. And of course they listened. Maybe he's right. So they cried aloud. And then they resort to something they knew would get a God's attention, or they thought, and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances until the blood gushed out on them. Again, they're hoping, all right, this will get Baal's attention. He's going to burn up the sacrifice now if we do this. And when midday was past, they prophesied. Prophesy? What would they prophesy? He's going to do it. Any minute now, you watch, he will burn this up. And then a minute would pass. Well, next hour, we're sure. Whatever. Until the time, so all day long of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that was offered typically around twilight. It's been a long day. And no result. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. A great build-up, and the guest of honor never shows. And by the end of the day, these guys are exhausted, and they're bleeding, and they're tired, and they're frustrated. Then verse 30, now I believe this is the next day, because it's going to take time for Elijah to do what he's going to do before he even offers his, and it says he's going to offer his at the time of the evening sacrifice, as it were. All right? Then Elijah said to all the people, so I'm thinking this is probably the very next day, because the other prophets have had all day long. It's now twilight and nothing has happened. So he says to all the people, come near me. So all the people came near to him, except the false prophets. I think they were too frustrated and exhausted to move. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. There had been an altar built on Mount Carmel to God at one point in time. And Elijah took 12 stones. This might take your minds. I know it takes the mind of Don Jones back to Joshua chapter 4. I think as he was presiding over the Lord's table recently, he talked about that event, that memorial when the Israelites getting ready to cross the Jordan River took 12 stones from the river and made a special monument. So when the children of the children of Israel would say, what do these 12 stones represent? And they would tell them about the crossing of the Jordan, crossing in the promised land, all that. All right. So Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word, remember that expression we read this morning, the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. Then with all the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord. So this was for God's purpose, to glorify God, nothing else. And he made a trench, interesting, around the altar, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. I'm told that's about 13 quarts. And he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And then the most curious thing, and I think the prophets of Baal and the Asherah, as they see this, they're thinking, is this guy nuts? What is he doing? All right, so he said, fill 4 water pots with water and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. Why would he do that? They're thinking, well, even Baal wouldn't be able to burn a wet sacrifice with soaked wood. Then he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it the third time. So water ran all around the altar and filled the trench with water. So it soaks everything, and now there's a little moat around the altar. And of course, why does he do that? To make it almost impossible for any God but a real God to burn that sacrifice. And again, the prophets of Baal are thinking, this guy is crazy. Nothing's going to burn that. All right. Verse 36. So it came to pass, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, again, now around twilight again, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. So this wasn't just a off-the-cuff plan. This is something God told him to do. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people, you see, he knows God will hear him, But these people need to know that. That these people may know that you are the Lord God and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. Whenever I read that, I think about our nation. I think about Ed Carpenter's prayer this morning, the closing prayer, as he prayed for our nation to turn back to God in righteousness. God has done so much for our nation to keep our nation faithful, at least as faithful as possible, more faithful than we are now. And yet many in this nation have just ignored that or just attributed it to luck or karma or whatever. All right, verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust. Some years ago I read what temperature fire would have to be to burn solid rock. I don't remember it now. I should have looked it up. It takes a mighty hot fire. You know one thing that would do it, by the way? Lightning. Lightning has actually fused some of the things in rocks together, almost turning, sand, if it gets hot enough, can become like molten. In fact, they make glass, some of it, from different types of sand, but it would take something from heaven. So it licks up everything. And it licked up the water that was in the trench. Obviously, if it's hot enough to get those stones burning, as it were, it would do that. All right, verse 39. Then when all the people saw it, how could they not? They fell on their faces. They're stunned, they're humbled, they're a little afraid maybe. And they said, the Lord, and they were speaking of Jehovah, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And Elijah's seeing their change of heart. I don't think Ahab joined in that, by the way. But the people, at least the vast majority, did. So he's now got courage. So he said to them, seize the prophets of Baal. Now understand that command, because they knew seize means to arrest, to apprehend. I have a feeling that once this fire came down from heaven and just devoured everything, that the prophets of Baal were beginning to back off, maybe going in some other direction. Well, he stopped that. Seize the prophets of Baal, and some of these Israelites had been worshiping under these prophets for years. Do not let one of them escape. So they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. And again, he didn't do that because he was angry. That was God's command. Everything he does here is by the command of God. Now, the story does not end there. And we'll continue, God willing, next Sunday night. But this part of the story reveals an obvious truth. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I pray America, whatever it takes, will come to realize that. And acknowledge that money is not God. A great retirement fund or account, a good education or things or hobbies or people or self are not God. Those things may appear for a time to bring us security, but in the end, all those things will be gone, destroyed, just as is a sacrifice and the dust and the stones were. And only one thing will remain. That is only one God, the true one, God in heaven. God says of Himself, for I am God and there is no other. I am God, there is none like me. Isaiah 46, verse 9. Thank you for believing in God so much that you're here tonight to worship Him. And may our worship continue and continue and continue until this world is no more, until we are gone to a better place. Jesus, in responding to a temptation of Satan in Matthew chapter 4, verse 10, said, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only Him only you shall serve. A part of serving God means accepting Jesus Christ as God's Son and treating Him as such. That is following Him and obeying Him with all your heart. Jesus said in John 6:29, "This is the work of God, that you believe in Him whom He sent." Jesus also said, "He who rejects me rejects Him who sent me." Luke 10:16. Jesus also said, "He who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father." John 14:21. To be continued. Thank you again for being here tonight. If anybody needs to respond to the invitation, you can come up when we stand and sing and have a seat up here. If you need to obey the gospel, and I don't like even saying it. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, you need to. If you need our prayers tonight, you need to come up and let us know. If you need to respond in any way, please come as we stand and sing the song together.